This is a story about the Lead Hills mining bears. A long, long time ago, in a little village at the top of the hills, lived a bear community. Our bears worked very hard in the lead mines, which were deep inside the hills. Our story starts very early one morning. Fires were being lit, pots were filled and set on the stoves, and breakfast was underway. There was only one thing to have in the village for breakfast, and that was porridge. But that was as it should be, because all bears eat porridge. You could have it with sugar or with salt, but it was always topped off with the creamiest milk from Mr. McGregor's farm. Mr. McGregor was one of the few bears who didn't work in the mine. Mr. Moffat was a supervisor in the mine, and that was a very important job, as he had to make sure that everything worked properly so that everyone was safe. Mines can be very dangerous places if you're not careful. Mr. Moffat finished his breakfast, pulled on his big boots, wrapped his scarf around his neck and put on his cap, then set off along the path to the end of the village. It was still dark because it was very, very early in the morning. He carried his oil lamp in one hand and his lunchbox in the other. Very soon all the little village paths were full of bears making their way to the mine. Bears are very quiet, and although they were chatting as they walked, there wasn't a lot of noise, because bears have very sensitive ears and don't ever shout at each other. "Good morning, Mr. McNab," said Mr. Cameron. "It's a fine morning." "Indeed it is," replied Mr. McNab, who was quite a large bear with a big tummy. Bears would never have called anyone fat, because that would be impolite. Bears were never impolite to each other. Very soon the bears were hard at work. Some were chipping away at the rock a long way inside the mine. Others were filling the wagons full of rocks, and some of the younger bears were pulling the wagons all the way back outside the mine. Inside the mine it was very dark, and each bear had his own lamp to help him see. Some days it was very cold, but our bears never complained. They worked very hard until the lunchtime horn sounded, and they all stopped to eat. Inside their lunch boxes they had homemade oatcakes and cheese, and they each had a jug of fresh water that they had filled from the fountain outside the mine. Where they were working was at least half a mile into the mine, and it was too far to come back to the surface, so they ate their lunch wherever they had been working. By this time of day, most of the bears had black faces from all the dust inside the mine, and it was hard to tell them apart. For the dark bears, it wasn't so obvious, but there were one or two white bears, and by the end of the day they looked like penguins, all black and white. Now, in the middle of the village there was a very large bell. The bears called it the curfew bell. Normally it was only rung at night to tell the bears it was time for bed. If it rang during the day, it was much more serious. And this was one of those days. It was early in the afternoon when the bell sounded, and everyone knew that something had happened in the mine. Mr. McGregor hitched up his cart, and with his big Clydesdale horse pulling it, he made his way to the mine. Mr. McPrice closed up his shop and ran to the mine. Miss Mackay, the school teacher, stopped lessons, and all the bear children watched from the schoolroom windows. And all the wife bears stopped their cleaning and sewing and hurried along towards the mine. "What's happened?" said Mrs. Moffat, when she saw her husband, coughing and covered in more dust than usual. "Some rocks have fallen inside, and there are some workers trapped," he replied. "We need everybody's help." Mr. McGregor and Mr. McPrice were given hard hats to wear, and they followed Mr. Moffat back into the mine. Halfway along, their path was blocked by large rocks, much too large for any of the bears to move. "We'll need to use my horse to shift these," said Mr. McGregor. "I'll go out and fetch some rope." Very soon they had tied one end of the rope to the horse's harness, and the other end was put around the first rock. Very slowly the horse walked forward, with Mrs. Moffat holding his reins. Gradually the first big rock started moving towards the mine entrance. It took a long time, but eventually the horse had pulled it clear of the mine. They had to do this over and over again, until all of the biggest rocks were out of the way. "Now," said Mr. Moffat, "we need to make a long line of bears from inside the mine right back to the entrance. Then we can hand the smaller rocks along the line and out of the mine." For a long time they passed rocks along the line until at last the path was clear, and they could see the bears that had been trapped. Mr. Cameron had a big bump on his head, but he was able to walk out into the daylight. Mr. Sterling, who was the mine manager, had only popped into the mine from his office to see how things were doing when he had been trapped. Luckily he wasn't hurt, but his very best suit was all torn and covered in dust, and he had lost his spectacles. Mr. Scott, unfortunately, had to be carried out because he had hurt his leg. After Dr. McEwen had examined him, they made a splint to support the injured leg, and Mr. Scott was put onto the farmer's cart and taken home. Thankfully, no one had been seriously injured, and Mr. Sterling had told all the mining bears to go home for the rest of the day. Mines can be very dangerous places, but with everyone's help they had prevented a disaster, and everyone was safe and well. When the bell sounded at bedtime, all of the bears were glad to be able to get some sleep and be ready for tomorrow and another day in the mine. Except, of course, Mr. Scott, who had been told to stay at home and have some rest until his leg had mended. The little village became very quiet as all the lamps in the little cottages went out one by one, and if you were to look up into the hills very late at night, you wouldn't know there was a village there at all.